Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos we are taking a look at David Lewis's book on the plurality of worlds. And by now we have reached the halfway point. So in chapter 1 of the book, Lewis sets out his theory of modal realism. In chapter 2 of the book, he considers some objections to that theory and tries to show that those objections are not really a problem. At that point, at the point where we are now, Lewis is kind of going to assume that you are with him, right? That you agree that his approach to modality is the right one. And now we are going to look in chapter 3 at whether we really need to be modal realists or whether there might be some closely aligned other theory, but a theory that is sort of almost structurally identical to Lewis's, but doesn't need to posit all these other possible worlds as things that are sort of really there. Whether there's some other theory that can work in the same way as Lewis's theory and give us the same benefits, but with a more safe and sane ontology. So that is why chapter 3 is called Paradise on the Cheap. And the question is whether we can get this modal paradise of possible worlds without accepting the ontology of all these possible worlds. So what is a little bit strange about the chapter is that Lewis is going to talk about three different kinds of alternatives to his own theory. Linguistic Azatism, pictorial Erzatzism, and magical Azatism, of which only one is actually to be found in the literature, according to Lewis. So he is telling us that some authors have put forward linguistic Erzatzism, some authors have, claimed to be ersatzists, but haven't really told us how or in what way or in what sense, and nobody actually defends pictorial or magical Erzatzism. Okay, so why does Lewis structure the chapter in this way? He structures it in this way because he thinks that these are roughly the three possibilities. And so because he can't sort of directly attack people who claim to be ersatzists but don't tell us enough details about their theory, Lewis is going to set out the space of possible theories, and he's going to try to argue that, although maybe some of them actually work, they're not better, and in fact they are worse than his own modal realism. So that is the task of the chapter. Now, my own interest in the book is mainly in the first half, because I do not, in fact, agree with Lewis's whole approach, which he sets out in these first two chapters. And so here, when we are sort of embracing the approach, but looking at different ways of implementing it, that becomes a little bit further away from my concerns, and that might be one of the reasons why I'm going to move a little bit more quickly, why I'm going to have one video about chapter 3, even though I had more videos about each of the previous chapters. But I think there are still, really interesting things to be gleaned from chapter 3, especially the discussion of linguistic Erzatzism, but also some of the other stuff. So let's look at that. And I will, in fact, start with, let's first look at page 140, where Lewis says that he understands the attraction of Erzatzism. So he says that Erzatzism is indeed attractive. I must agree that the ersatzers have the advantage in agreement with common sense about what there is, and this is an advantage well worth having. And their abstract ersatz possibilia can indeed do much of the work of the real thing. But I insist that they pay a high price. I cannot say once and for all what the price is, because ersatzism comes in different versions, which have different advantages and different drawbacks. But I do claim that each version in its own way is in serious trouble. In different ways for different versions, the ersatzers must resort to primitive facts, where genuine modal realists can offer analyses, or their ways of making ersatz worlds distorts the facts of modality, or their ontology is, after all, not so safe and sane. And so, in the end, it is his own modal realism that should come out as the best. All right, let's look at the first of these types of Erzatzism, which is linguistic Azatism. So what is linguistic Azatism? Well, what we need, right, in order to sort of have Lewis's project but not Lewis's ontology, is we need something else, some other kind of entity that can play the role that a possible world plays for Lewis. And that role for the linguistic Azatism is some kind of linguistic entity. It is something like a story or a description, right? Instead of having a possible world out there in which, to use Lewis's favorite example, in which there is a talking donkey, we can tell a story in which there is a talking donkey. Like maybe we tell the story of Shrek. That's not Lewis's example because Shrek hadn't been made yet when he wrote this book, but otherwise it would definitely have been full of Shrek references. So, a talking donkey. I can tell a story about a talking donkey, and in order for it to really be this something that can play the role of a possible world, this story should be maximally specific, right? It should describe the entire world in every detail. Well, not really describe a world, because there is no world, but it should be the kind of story that would have described the world if the world had been the way that the story claims it to be. Right? It's a false description of our world. We shouldn't think of it as a true description of a possible world, because then we are back at Lewis's own modal realism. So, Lewis agrees that this is a safe and sane ontology. Right? Because what we have is just linguistic items like maybe words or sentences or propositions. Maybe we need to combine them in certain ways, but we can probably do that using some set theoretical constructions. And so Lewis, says that he basically agrees that if this theory works just as well as modal realism, then it would in fact be better than modal realism. Right? If this theory works as good as modal realism in giving us a theory of modality, then it would be better than modal realism because its ontology is safer and saner. Right? You need to postulate fewer things, only things that you already have, without also postulating all those possible worlds. So Lewis spends some time explaining what exactly can play the role of a possible world here, how we have to think about language, and how we have to think about possible individuals, because they can't be parts of possible worlds as in his own approach. They have to be something else. And so he spells all of that out in some detail. And then at the bottom of page 150, Lewis is going to talk about his objections, like the problems that he sees for linguistic Erzatzism. Okay. My first objection is that modality must be taken as primitive. Right? So what we would like to have here is a theory of modality, something that modality comes out of but is not put into. At least that is the way that Lewis thinks about this, right? I mean, that is the kind of desideratum that he takes such theories of modality to have, and he believes that his own theory has it. So you don't have to put modality into it, and that modality comes out of it. But Lewis says there are at least two ways in which linguistic Erzatzism needs, two sort of almost competing ways in which it needs some kind of primitive modality. First, via consistency, right? How do we know whether two sentences are consistent with each other? Because, I mean, any story is only going to describe a possible world equivalent if it's consistent, right? If it's not saying things that are inconsistent, in which case it would be describing an impossibility, insofar as such a thing makes sense, describing an impossibility. So we need consistency, and what is it for two sentences to be consistent? Well, it is for it to be possible that they are both true. So if we require consistency, and if we generate possibility from the idea of consistency, then it would seem that we have already put in the notion of possibility, namely the notion of possibly being true together, at the beginning of the story, in order to get that same notion of possibility, basically, out at the end. And so we would be introducing primitive modality into our theory in a way that makes at least one of the things that a theory of modality can do impossible. And Lewis tells us that there is a second need for primitive modality in linguistic ersatzism, which is through implicit representation. So implicit representation is when I represent something without explicitly representing it. So if I tell you that, let's say, if I tell you that the David Lewis book on the plurality of possible worlds is very near to me, and if I tell you that my hot cup of tea is very near to me, then I'm also implicitly telling you that my hot cup of tea and my David Lewis book are near to each other. Right? I mean, they could at most be twice as far from each other as each of them is from me. So I'm implicitly telling you something that follows from the things that I told you. Now, why would we need implicit representation? We need implicit representation when we describe worlds in a vocabulary in which we cannot say everything explicitly. So suppose that we describe a world by describing the positions of all the atoms in the world, all the particles in the world, and that's it, right? I describe the exact state of every particle in the world, and there I stop, because that might be enough to describe what happens in the entire world. Well, in order to know whether or not talking donkeys are possible, I would have to be able to see whether some description in terms of particles implicitly represents a donkey talking. Right? It doesn't explicitly do so, because donkey is not the name of a particle, but a collection of particles in a certain constellation might be a talking donkey, and so I might be implicitly representing a talking donkey. And so Lewis tells us quite correctly, I would say, that if we have a very rich language in which we describe the worlds, then consistency becomes something that we have to worry about. If I can talk about particles and I can talk about talking donkeys, well, I had better not be describing a world in which no particles are ever in a donkey constellation, and I'm at the same time claiming that there's a donkey, right? That would be an inconsistency. On the other hand, if I pare down my language, make it very poor, have very few sort of terms and words and relations, then the consistency becomes easier maybe to guarantee, but I need lots and lots of implicit representation, right? I need to represent donkeys implicitly through talking about particles. And now the problem with implicit representation is that it also seems to be modal, right? What is it to claim that I'm implicitly representing a talking donkey? Well, basically it means that if the particles are the way they are, then there must be a talking donkey, that it's impossible for the particles to be arranged this way without there being a talking donkey, right? So again, modality seems to come in. Here's a really good question. Doesn't Lewis's theory have the same feature? Because what Lewis puts into his theory is the principle of recombination, which tells us that every recombination of things is possible, that every recombination of properties in space and time gives us another possible world. Every recombination of things is possible. Well, that's an ingredient in how we get possible worlds according to Lewis's story. And so it might seem that modality for Lewis too is something that we put in as a primitive. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes probably, because, well, actually on page 154, Lewis is going to say some things that are very relevant to understanding how he thinks about that. So, what is, let's just move to that immediately, because I don't think I have, there's anything in the pages in between that I absolutely need to talk about. Here's what Lewis says on page 154. He says, the second bad reason arises out of a misunderstanding about what circularity is. When he specifies his axioms as a step toward defining ersatz worlds and implicit representation and eventually modality itself, the ersatzer presumably is guided by his pre-existing modal opinions. He adds this truth to his axioms because he takes it to be necessary, declines to add that one because he takes it to be contingent. Then even if he ends with a correct definition of necessity and contingency, isn't his procedure circular? No. Circularity is a matter of what you analyze in terms of what. It is not a matter of why you think your analysis is right. And at the end of this little paragraph, Lewis writes, the object of analysis is to reduce our burden of primitive notions and to make tacit understanding explicit, not to bootstrap ourselves into understanding what we didn't understand at all beforehand. So here is how this relates to my earlier question about Lewis and the principle of recombination and whether that is a form of primitive modality. Because what I think Lewis would say is this. He says, look, my analysis of modality is in terms of possible worlds, right? The possible worlds, the real ones. Now, if you want to think about which possible worlds there are, then use the principle of recombination, which of course requires for its statement that you already have a grasp of what possibility means, right? If I tell you that any recombination of properties is possible if space and time permit it, right? If space and time don't make it impossible, I'm sort of already assuming that you know what possibility and impossibility and the other modal concepts mean. But if you look at my analysis, right? If you look at how I analyze a modal statement, well, it's in terms of the possible worlds, right? Those that are out there, well, maybe not there in some spatial sense, but the ones that there are. And that's it. That's my analysis. And there's no primitive analysis no primitive modality in my analysis. And I think that Lewis might be right about that. Of course, this requires us to adopt a certain way of thinking about what we're doing here, right? We are trying to give a non-circular analysis, and we're not trying to understand how we come to think in terms of modality, for instance. We're not trying to understand how it is possible for us to have modal thought. We're not trying to understand what it is that makes us the kind of entity, the kind of being that can think modally. We're not trying to make sense of how we make sense of things. I think that's very important because there is also a very, very influential conception of metaphysics, according to which it is precisely about making sense of how we make sense of things. That is not the way that Lewis is thinking about this. And so, one of the things we can say here is that Lewis's approach and, let's say, a Kantian approach are from the very beginning, they operate with completely different goals in mind, with completely different, moving towards a completely different endpoint where they want to be. So for Lewis, what we really want to do is we want to reduce the number of primitive notions in our theories, and that's it, right? And we want to do that in a way that also allows us to reduce the number of primitive entities in our ontologies. That's it. It's all about parsimony. It's all about what Quine once famously called desert landscapes. That's the point. It's not the self-investigation of reason, which is how Kant might define what good philosophy or good metaphysics is trying to do. Okay, so obviously this is not the place to wonder whether Lewis or Kant is right, if that's even the kind of question that we can, really answer, rather than just looking at what these people are doing and seeing what interests us more or what seems to be more fundamental. I guess that you can... I know that you can make a pretty good guess at where my own proclivities lie, what I prefer, but that's neither here nor there. It's important for us to understand the kind of project that Lewis is embarking on. Okay, so what Lewis concludes, and this is page 156, is that linguistic ersatzism must indeed take modality as primitive. And that is not where its problems end. My second objection this is page 157, concerns the descriptive power of the world-making language. If it is a language that can be specified, complete with interpretation, by a this-worldly theorist, and in a sense it had better be because there are no other worldly theorists, right? This is the only world, according to the ersatzer. Then it must have limited descriptive resources, and then it cannot distinguish all the possibilities it should. And the first kind of possibility that it can't distinguish is a problem about indiscernibles. Not so much indiscernible worlds. Lewis doesn't really claim that there are indiscernible worlds, but indiscernible individuals. Like, okay, and now we are back at these sort of eternal recurrence worlds where you have the same thing happening again and again into backwards and forwards infinity. And so there are infinitely many Napoleons, and there is no way to linguistically pick out one of them. Right? You just can't do it. You cannot pick out one of them using language. And so if there are no Napoleons, right, if this world isn't like there, if it doesn't exist, if there are not all these Napoleons, then there's no way to sort of get at this multiplicity of individuals here, at all these different individuals, and sort of even talk about one of them in particular. Of course, Lewis can't talk about one of them in particular, but he has the entities that can play this role. The linguistic ersatzer has only descriptions, has only talk, and he can't talk about these different possibilities, and so there is something missing from his theory of modality. The same problem, or a closely related problem, arises when it comes to alien properties. So the second problem of descriptive power is that if a world-making language is specifiable by a this-worldly theorist, then it cannot be expected to have a rich enough vocabulary to describe and to distinguish all the different possibilities there are. And this is especially true when there are things that we cannot name. When there are things that we, in using language, cannot talk about. Right? What things could there be that we cannot talk about? Properties that are not instantiated in this world, but that are only instantiated in other worlds. Okay, there are no properties instantiated in other worlds because there are no other worlds according to the ersatzer, but this is what Lewis says about that, and this is page 160. An ersatzer will not agree that there are any properties instantiated of in other worlds, since he does not believe that there are any other worlds. Nevertheless, he somehow understands modality, and I should hope he would find it compelling to say, simply, that there might have been other natural properties than there are. Right? So, what the ersatzer, the linguistic ersatzer, wants to do, according to Lewis, is, well, two things. Right? First of all, he's a linguistic ersatzer, so he wants to say that it's these linguistic descriptions that ground our all modal truths. And the second thing he wants to say, because according to Lewis everybody should want to say this, is that there could have been properties that there actually are not, right? Like fundamental properties, like what Lewis calls natural properties. So in our world there maybe are things like mass and charge and so on, but there could have been other properties. And now Lewis tells us that you can't talk about those other properties, right? Not in a language that we can speak. Because those properties, the only way to talk about them is to name them. But we can't name them because they don't exist, right? They're not here. There's nothing here that we can point to or look at or whatever. There's no way for us to name them. There's nothing there to be named, really, because these other properties don't exist. According to the ersatzer, they're nowhere, right? There's no instantiation of those properties. So they can't be named. So our linguistic resources can never be such that we can talk about them. And so the linguistic ersatzer would be in a position where he has to say that there is a possibility, namely that there could have been other properties that you can nowhere find in his ersatz worlds, because you can't talk about it. So there is no linguistic representation of this other property. Okay, well, what about that? Well, this, I guess, is a powerful argument, but it does require some very non-trivial philosophical commitment, which we get into view a couple of pages later on pages 162 and 163. So here is something that Lewis writes on page 162. He says, he has said what roles for properties are occupied, but he has not said, and he could not possibly say, which properties occupy which roles. So I could maybe try to get at a property by specifying a particular role for it to play. I could say something like, okay, maybe there's a possible world in which there is no such thing as mass, but there is Q bars. What is Q bars? Well, Q bars is the property that is in a sense just like mass, right? It fits the law of gravity. It is sort of the charge of the law of gravity, except that this law of gravity doesn't work with r squared, but with r to the third, right? It's a cube law of gravity rather than a square law of gravity, and that's why I don't call it mass, but Q bars. So, you know, there's a property that doesn't exist in the real world, Q bars, that does exist in these other possible worlds, and which I can perfectly describe in my language by specifying its role. Lewis doesn't want to have any of that. Right? He says, okay, you have said what roles for properties are occupied, but you have not said, and you could not possibly say, which properties occupy which roles. Here we are with names for properties that he cannot name. We can distinguish our world from one in which, say, one of the quark collars has traded places with one of the flavors. The two possibilities are isomorphic, yet different. So, I mean, if you're not like really into quantum chromodynamics, so there are supposed to be these particles that make up protons and electrons and so on, and they're called quarks. And quarks have collars, and quarks have flavors, which are, I mean, they have nothing to do with real color or real flavor. It's just sort of physicists having a bit of fun. And now what Lewis is saying is, look, I mean, these properties have certain functional roles. So color does, you know, one kind of thing, and the flavors do some other kind of thing. Well, what if one of the colors trades places with one of the flavors? So there's another world where this property plays that role, and this property plays that role. Another way to think of it, maybe easier, is to take a more familiar example. What about a world which is just like ours, except that mass and positive charge have traded places? So it's a world where positive charge works like mass does in our world, and mass works like positive charge works in our world. This is supposed to show that there's a difference between the role that a property occupies and the property itself. I would say that it doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense. You need some very specific philosophical commitments before you think that this does make some sense. Okay, let's read what Lewis himself has to say about this. He writes, "Here I expect a rejoinder. Is it really possible that a quark color and a flavor should trade places? Or do such properties as these have their nomological roles or their causal powers essentially? If so, as has been suggested by Shoemaker and Sawyer, then a property with the nomological role of a certain quark color would have to be that quark color and could not be one of the flavors instead. Then it may be, after all, that the philosopher in the simpler world has the resources to describe our world, or any world, completely. It is enough if he can specify the relevant nomological role. And if he has adequate resources to describe any world, so a fortiori do we. So my objection rests on denying the thesis of essential nomological roles." So Lewis has to deny that something like mass, that mass sort of essentially is the property that, you know, follows the gravitational law. That he has to say that there are other possible worlds where mass works just like charge or color or spin or whatever, right? I support this denial by means of the principle of recombination. Start with a world where the quark colors and flavors do figure in the laws that are supposed to be essential to them. By patching together duplicates of things from that world, we can presumably describe a world where those laws are broken. Yet perfectly natural properties are intrinsic ex officio, and so they can never differ between duplicates. The principle of recombination seems to me very compelling indeed, and it ought to be no less compelling when reformulated in an ersatzist fashion. Now, Lewis is right when he says that the principle of recombination implies that properties do not have essential roles. Because what you can do is you take things with mass and you take things with charge and you recombine them in a new tapestry, such that mass acts like charge and charge acts like mass. Yes. But of course the principle of recombination is the principle that claims that anything can be combined with anything else. And the claim that properties have essential roles is the claim that properties can only be combined in ways that fit those essential roles. And so to say that you have an argument against the idea that properties have essential roles, namely that the principle of recombination is true, sounds to me like saying that you have an argument against A, which is that not A is true. That's the question, right? And in fact, if you think that properties do have essential roles, that gives you a very, very good reason to reject the principle of recombination. And so it seems to me that Lewis is simply begging the question here, right? Lewis is taking his own Humean conviction that something like the principle of recombination must be true, and somehow it follows from that Humeanism is right? That things cannot, that there are no essential functional roles for properties and stuff like that. I don't think it's convincing, but of course it would be convincing against a linguistic ersatz theorist who also wants to be a Humean. Right? So the sort of the logical structure of what's going on here, what Lewis is doing is correct. Whether it is dialectically effective depends on whether the linguistic ersatzist wants to be a Humean. Okay. If they do, then Lewis's counter-argument is pretty strong. If they don't, then Lewis's counter-argument doesn't seem to be very good at all. And of course, if they don't, then there will be far fewer ersatz worlds than Lewisian worlds by design, right? And so the whole claim that the ersatzist cannot represent all the possibilities is going to also beg the question, because this non-Humean ersatzist is going to believe that there are far fewer possibilities than the possibilities that Lewis believes that there are. Alright, that's what I wanted to say about linguistic ersatzism. I won't say very much at all about the rest of the chapter, especially not about pictorial ersatzism. So the problem with pictorial ersatzism is that it sort of generates something, it posits something that for all the world looks like a possible world, but is not supposed to be a possible world. And Lewis spent some time suggesting that you can't really get the benefits of possible worlds without turning the pictorial worlds of the pictorial things into the possible worlds themselves. Which, maybe that's fine. And in the section on magical ersatzism, Lewis presses for what is going on here? How can something represent a possibility? What is necessary for something to represent a possibility? And he suggests that there's no good story to tell here unless you're willing to go back to one of the earlier options. All right. Is there something I want to say about that? Well, I think what is maybe interesting, one of the interesting things that happens here is what happens on page 184 and later on, in which we can see we get a little bit more insight into the general methodological approach that Lewis takes. So I want to read out something that happens on page 184. Our use of the names like states of affairs and ways things might be, our use of the names associates them in the first instance with roles in our thought. I suppose it is a firm commitment of common sense that there are some entities or other that fill the roles, and therefore deserve the names. But that is not to say that we have much notion what sort of entities those are. We can toss the names around and never think what manner of entities we are talking about. Only when we want to improve on common sense and get something more systematic and unified and definite does the question arise. The entities that deserve the names are the entities best suited to fill the roles. To figure out what those are, we must survey the candidates according to our best systematic theory of what there is. It is no good saying, which are they? Why? They are the states of affairs. And he says things like this a couple of times more in the pages that follow. All this is a matter of fitting suitable entities to the various rather ill-defined roles that we rather indecisively associate with various familiar names. Or again, what is not fair is just to declare the entities that play the roles are none other than the entities that play the roles. Or again, it is unfair just to declare the entities that play those roles are none other than the properties. So here is something that we sort of get the methodological framework in which some of the things that happened in chapter 1 start to make sense. So for instance, one of the things that Lewis claimed in chapter 1 is that propositions are sets of possible worlds. Right? And that might seem a very strange declaration indeed, because a proposition is something you can think. Presumably it's the content of a sentence, and whoa, I mean, I never thought an infinitely big set of possible worlds. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that Lewis is doing what he describes on page 184. Right? We have certain terms in our cognitive economy, if you wish, terms like a thought or a proposition or a content or, all that kind of stuff. A reason, an implication. And now what we would like to do, according to Lewis, is we want to find entities that fit a sparse ontology and yet can play the roles that our cognitive economy requires them to play. So if we find out that we talk about propositions, now the question is, okay, can we find somewhere entities, whatever they may turn out to be, that can play the role of propositions? Well, what about a set of possible worlds? Okay, one nice thing about them is that if we have sets of possible worlds, we can sort of define implication, which is a relation between propositions. I mean, A implies B, that is sort of isomorphic to the set of possible worlds A contains the set of possible worlds B. Right? Those are sort of isomorphic. And if I can get that isomorphism, like across the board, in all the situations where I want to talk about propositions, if I can make that work with possible worlds, sets of possible worlds, taking the role of propositions, then I have done what I needed to do. Right? So what I needed to do was to take some functional role in my cognitive economy and find some entity, never mind which, hopefully one I'm already committed to find some entity I'm already committed to and make it play that role by showing some kind of isomorphism. Apparently, well, in fact clearly, but Lewis emphasizes it here again and again, a fundamental presupposition of this approach is that we can't just talk about roles, right? We need entities to fill those roles. In order to understand our cognitive economy, it's no good to just say that a proposition is something that fits this and this role, or to say that a state of affairs is something that fits this and this role. We need to find something that can fit that role, something that can play that role. And Lewis uses here the example or analogy probably of finding a person who can play the role of Polonius in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Right? It's no good saying that there's the role of Polonius, and let's fill it with the role of Polonius. We need to find somebody, right, some person, to actually fill that role. Does that analogy work? Well, I don't know. Maybe not. Why do we think that our cognitive economy is not, like, intrinsically functional and defined in terms of functions? What do we gain when we take apparently completely intelligible talk about propositions and then add that propositions are to be identified with sets of possible worlds. I don't know. I mean, I am not convinced that this is a right way of doing philosophy, or that it is, a project that is worth embarking on. But it's the way that Lewis sees a lot of what he is doing, and so it is very important for us to read these pages and digest these pages if we want to understand Lewis's project and how he tries to perform it. And I think that what happens here at the end of chapter 3 actually therefore casts some light on some of the things that Lewis is saying in chapter 1, when he is actually trying to show how his own theory of possible worlds is a useful project and can give us some of the things that we want to be given. One of the ways it does that is by giving us entities that we can put in relations that are isomorphic to the relations of some of the roles that we recognize in our own thinking. And that means that we can identify them, according to Lewis. Okay. That is what I wanted to say about chapter 3. Next video, we're going to look at the final chapter, chapter 4.